Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the season finale of Your Legislators. I'm your host, Johnny Coker. Joining me to talk about the final stretch of the legislative session up in Santa Fe is the Senator for New Mexico's 35th District, Crystal Diamond Brantley. Senator Diamond Brantley, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm joining you from Santa Fe. We're wrapping up the end of a 30-day budget session up here.
Absolutely, and you're a member of the Senate Finance Committee, and you're heavily involved in this budgetary process. And there's been, billions of dollars, $3.5 billion around there in surplus over current spending obligations driven by the oil and gas industry. So what kind of opportunities is this going to unlock for legislators and for New Mexicans? I'm just going to lay it out for you. What have things looked like up there so far?
Yeah, Johnny, we're going to be passing the largest state budget in New Mexico history. That is thanks to a very strong oil and gas economy in southeastern New Mexico that is now accounting for about half of the state's budget. When we arrived for LFC members, for Senate Finance members, we arrived a week early before the session even started to start hearing agency requests as we begin to build this budget. The budget proposal from LFC came to us at $10 billion. The governor's proposal came at about 10.5. It looks to me like it'll leave the legislator around $10.1 billion. That's a large amount of money. To put it in perspective, in my short term here in the legislature, this is just my fourth session, we have grown this budget. I think we started passing a $6 billion budget. We're so quickly at $10.5 billion that come before us. It's a lot of money. So the question is, how do we make sure that we are good stewards of that money, that we are investing this money so that we can see long-time returns off of those investments, that we're not just squandering this money? Because as you know, Johnny, the oil and gas industry is a volatile industry. There will be inevitable downturns in that industry. We want to make sure that we're reserving revenues to prepare for those inevitable downturns.
And I want to talk a little bit about the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of legislation, obviously, floating around regarding that industry. I want to hear your take. I know there's bills floating around that would raise the tax on the oil and gas industry to 25% from 20% to the same level as Texas. Is that something that you've heard and something that you would be in support of? That's something I was curious about.
I haven't seen that bill come across my committee. I don't know if that's traveling. This is the irony, really, and the hypocrisy sometimes we see is that when we're talking about this $10 billion budget, a lot of these revenues are recurring revenues. And so we are obligating ourselves to long-term expenses. Those proposals will come to us, and then the very next proposal will somehow attempt to shut down or overregulate the same industry that is paying for those proposals that are brought to us. And so you can't want the goose and then, want the golden egg and then attempt to kill the goose all the time. What we can agree on, though, is that industry, not just oil and gas, has a responsibility to make sure that citizens and the environment is clean and safe. And if they continue to operate in a clean and safe manner and account for half of the state's budget, which allows us to build roads, improve on our schools, expand our police force, invest in healthcare, if those revenues, which we are so dependent on, really move New Mexico forward and they can create those revenues through clean and safe manners, this is a win-win for all New Mexicans.
And so as a legislator, how do you really balance that, the issue of, making sure the environment is well taken care of and New Mexicans' health is taken care of, and also keeping the state running with these revenues and making sure that it's a healthy economic environment for the oil and gas industry? How do you find that balance?
It's relatively easy because the industry itself is so regulated that it is clean and safe. We haven't had any major accidents at all. In fact, it's one of our most regulated industries that there is. So the complaints on oil and gas we take very seriously. They spend a lot of time before us and have very strict regulations through the Environment Department, through Energy and Minerals, in which they have to abide by. Some of the most devastating accidents that we've learned of that have taken place in the oil and field industry was actually a fault of the state, which is disappointing to us. And so to find out that when we were discussing bad apples, that we were actually the bad apples that, sometimes don't do our part to make sure that the environment stays clean and safe. Accidents happen and we need to be prepared for those. But generally speaking, we haven't had any major issues with our oil and gas industries.
And well, in the last year, I know there's been some earthquakes tied to the oil and gas industry with produced water being injected into the ground and is essentially causing some seismicity. And that has brought up some concerns, especially from environmental groups. Do you have any response to them or anything that you'd like to say in terms of how we're going to, make sure that things are taken care of and things don't get out of hand in terms of that?
I think that those are all valid concerns. I have not, those concerns don't usually come before Senate Finance because there's not an appropriation tied to. I know that the governor is a big proponent of produced water. In fact, $500 million is a big ask that she's investing in produced water. I assume that she's had conversations with those concerns as she continues to make large investments in the production of water.
And so just to move on, I want to ask a little about something that you're sponsoring. That would be Senate Bill 92, which is the NMSU windmill certification. And that's sort of, in a way, it's an energy thing, a way for alternative energy to be invested in the state and here at New Mexico State University. So can you just tell me a little more about that bill that you introduced?
Yeah. They call it Windmill School at NMSU. It's been a program that's offered New Mexico State, but it has never really received substantial funding for it. In fact, I think it's funded through just some private donations. There's a great interest from our Navajo and our nations and our tribes that have been participating in this. But it's important to recognize that in rural New Mexico, windmills, and I'm talking about old school, windmills, and being able to harness the power of wind is still so important to be able to pump water both to homes and to provide and take care of livestock. And so it's just something that I think that needs to continue to have an investment. In rural New Mexico, we still need some of just standard industry investments. Windmills is one of them. Another industry that I was happy to invest in is providing a tax incentive for rail lines. So as you know, in my Senate district, I have Spaceport America, and I'm happy to invest in whatever it needs to take us to the new frontier of investments. But at the same time, we are still dependent, and old-fashioned railroad expansion is so important in rural New Mexico as well. And so we're giving some tax breaks to incentivize some short line spurs to come back into New Mexico just to keep trucks off the road and help industry continue to profit.
And Senator Diamond Brantley, you brought up Spaceport America. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on Virgin Galactic pausing flights out of the spaceport? And I know there are some citizens upset about that. So what is your response? What is your take on the situation?
When I had heard that too, Johnny, I was very concerned. Virgin Galactic is our anchor tenant at Spaceport. But I think it's very important that people recognize that we have other tenants out there doing really amazing work. We put a lot of emphasis into Virgin Galactic, but they are not our only tenants. And so we cannot manage Spaceport for just one tenant. There's some great stuff coming out of Spaceport. In conversations, though, that we've had with Virgin, and they've had a large presence here at the Legislator, they will return within, I think it's between 12 and 18 months. And those space flights are actually, with the new ship, will be happening more frequently. Their ask of New Mexico is they have had some very basic infrastructure requests that have gone ignored. The roof to the main dome continues to leak. They actually have tarps that are covering the mothership right now because the state is not repairing some basic needs out there at Spaceport. There's some runway repairs that need to happen. We have invested the capital to make these improvements. It's very important that we get this work on the ground so that we don't lose tenants if we're not doing our part to make sure that as landlords, as owners of Spaceport America, that we're making sure that the building itself and the infrastructure up there is maintained so that our tenants can operate efficiently.
And so, Senator, in my own reporting, I've talked to officials at both the county level and the city level there in Tier C that mention even wanting to essentially axe the spaceport tax, that they don't want their citizens paying for this because they don't feel like it's coming back to them, essentially. What is your response to that?
You know, the spaceport was created under Richardson. There has been so much investment that's made in spaceport. I can tell you that I actually understand local government's frustration. They have not seen a return on that. The greatest returns that we've started to see are actually within the last few years. You know, under the Lujan Grisham administration, she has made it more of a priority to go out there and recruit additional tenants so that we weren't so dependent on just that one anchor tenant. I think there's been some great progress in doing so. We have some amazing stuff happening out there. I'm at the point now where I think that we need to continue to make these investments because we continue to be narrowing that gap to actually seeing some great revenue returns.
And so where do you see the spaceport in the next 10 years, I guess?
You know, I would hope that we continue to, it's going to be critical that we diversify the number of tenants. We're going to have to do some major recruiting out there to get some additional tenants to come to relocate to New Mexico. And at some point, I'm open to still conversations where people discuss that if we can't manage spaceport as a state in the way we should consider turning it over and selling it to private business. And whatever that takes, whatever's in the best interest of New Mexico, considering our counties as well, we need to all be open to the best possibilities of what we end up doing with spaceport.
And Senator, I want to switch gears a little bit. I wanted to ask about paid family medical leave that went across your desk. I understand you voted against it. So I'm just going to lay out the floor a little bit for you. Why'd you vote against it, and what are your thoughts on this bill as it stands currently?
You know, paid family medical leave is going to have some very harmful impacts. The way I see it is a mandatory tax on employees. I would be much more supportive of something if they had the option to opt in to paid family medical leave. What this is it's been so expanded that it's not just medical leave. It's not just medical leave at all, and it's not just family. The definition of family is now anyone of, you know, an affinity that you have. It could be a neighbor. They refuse to define this. It has circumvented the Judiciary Committee so that we can get some definitions on this bill. There's a lot of divide. I think the biggest pushback for me was, one, it's a mandatory tax that in the long list of businesses that were consulted to be a part of something that would have such a far-reaching impact, not one business from my district that wakes up the entire southwest corner of New Mexico was consulted and had a seat at the table to make sure that they understood how this was going to impact. I feel like rural New Mexico was left out of this conversation, and my district encompasses the Mexico-New Mexico border, and a lot of our workforce that we are so greatly dependent on are migrant workers who are also not allowed to have an opt-out, an exemption carved into this bill. I think it's an unfair tax to put on them for a benefit that they will never benefit from, that they're having to give their part of their paycheck to something they will never see a benefit from. And I'm disappointed that they were not given an exemption as well.
So is there a world in which you are in support of a bill like this with certain provisions in it? Could you see yourself supporting a bill?
There is. The House has actually had a very similar bill. I think it's important that we have a responsibility to take care of our workforce here in New Mexico. And I think there's always compromise when you hear every idea and every concern to come to the table. There is a bill that's very similar that was introduced in the House that has been working on. And I appreciate the sponsors reaching out and asking for participation in the interim to draft that legislation. It's very different than this forceful, heavy-handed and bill that we're seeing in the Senate that just has such loose definitions that the answer is that I get on so many questions is no one knows. We'll pass the law and then we'll decide. New Mexico legislators have to stop just passing bills and then coming up and doing cleanup work.
And in terms of, you know, family medical leave and health care, that's obviously a big issue within the state of New Mexico. I wanted to get your take on the fentanyl crisis that our area is going through, your district down here in Las Cruces, Doña Ana County. You know, last year, the LCPD seized over 70,000 fentanyl pills in Las Cruces alone. And I was wondering, I saw that you have House Bill 106 that would make exposing children to fentanyl a crime. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? And yeah, let's talk about it.
I would. Some bills, we just mentioned paid family medical leave. A lot of bills have to have a call from the governor if it doesn't have a fiscal appropriation. We opened up by reminding viewers that this is a budget session, right? You can also have a bill heard that doesn't necessarily always have to have a fiscal appropriation by asking the governor to give it a message. One of those was HB 106. We tied an appropriation on there just to make it germane. The bill's not passing through, but that is in response to this. We have law enforcement up here talking us about, we are seeing a fentanyl crisis in the state of New Mexico. All you have to do is turn on your television, and it's just inundating law enforcement officers. And we've also seen a rise in the chaos of what's surrounding our child welfare system of children being exposed to fentanyl. It was brought to my attention that our laws are so outdated that fentanyl, being a relatively new drug on the market, that our laws have not kept up with the drug of choice out there, and that we needed to include fentanyl, that although methamphetamine, for example, is grounds for child abuse, exposing a child to that, usage in front of that, if it's found in a child's system, but fentanyl was not. So it seems like a very basic no-brainer, shouldn't have a lot of controversy. We are so disappointed to see that in the governor's pushback, her promise to come in and address child welfare, that bill is not moving. And that the governor's office has no interest in really addressing any CYFD or child welfare bills that were introduced this session.
And that is it is such a fast and furious session. Sometimes these bills, like you say, don't really have a chance of being passed. I wanted to talk about the CYFD. What are your thoughts on Teresa Casado in terms of being directed as the head of the CYFD? What's your take on that whole situation? I understand you voted against that. So what is your take?
It's very unusual for the Senate when it comes before us to do secretary confirmations to not vote in support. And I have always usually before, but I cast a vote of no confidence, and I expressed to her that this was not a personal vote. What happens is we're continue to seeing a revolving door of secretaries at a broken agency. One of the biggest failures is that we have no leadership and no continuity within a broken agency, and unfortunately the victims of that are our most vulnerable children out there. We're in a 30-day budget session, it's true, but when we're also in the middle of a crisis in New Mexico, as we continue to be the bottom of the list when it comes to child well-being and repeat victimization and maltreatment for these children. And so we can't continue to kick the can down the road. And the last 30-day session, the governor took no action on CYFD reform. And so in this 30 days, it is imperative that she had given messages or agreed to make some major changes to that so that it doesn't go a full 2 years before we discuss it again. There is a loud cry from the legislator on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the chambers where legislators have united and said enough is enough. We have got to come in and fix this agency. We are alone in that. It does not seem like the executive is supporting it. One of the most powerful messages sent by Democrat Senator Ortiz Pino, who has proposed a constitutional amendment that brings the issue to the voters of New Mexico, completely circumventing the governor to say, we have a crisis at CYFD, and I propose taking leadership away from the executive, creating a board, much like a board of regents, that would oversee this agency in crisis. And just the constitutional amendment, with pressure from the fourth floor, is not traveling through the legislative process like it should to give voters that option.
And the CYFD, it seems like, based on reporting, that they don't really have the resources that they need to deal with the crisis that's on their hand. And I understand that the budget is increasing some funds going to that department, but it seems, from what I saw from reporting on you, is that you were not for just throwing more money at the problem. Is that correct?
These are unproven programs that they're asking for us. The LFC has done some major research in programs that actually work. We were asking them to continue those investments, that money to be invested in programs with proven results. We are also very much supportive of expanding funding to increase their workforce. When the new secretary came on as a designee, she put out a hiring freeze. And we were so confused by that. When you talk about how we don't have enough social workers on the ground, not enough people reporting to these homes, to put out a hiring freeze just defied common sense for us. And so we're being very specific on where these funds need to go into that agency. They are a very well-funded agency and they get dollars. We can't make them do their job is the problem. And so we're having to put guardrails and legislation proposals in place that can't seem to get through the executive office. Look, there's one thing that doesn't come with a party label to that, and that is that New Mexicans want to see our children safe and taken care of, and especially those who are in immediate harm. It's not a partisan issue to say we are failing those kids, and whatever it takes needs to happen.
And Senator, I think it's fair to say that this particular department and this topic deserves a lot of discussion and a lot of research. And being such a short session, it's difficult for legislators to do that type of thing. And I was wondering, tied to that, are you in favor of lengthening the legislative session or any sort of reforms related to that?
You know, I would consider that. I would. I have to tell you that we are very active in the interim. And so many of us are assigned to interim committees, and these discussions happen throughout the year. CYFD is a very prime example of that. Many of the CYFD bills that are not going to be heard by the governor were actually committee endorsed. And so legislators spent a great amount of time coming up with some of the best proposals. That's the case on many issues. Rural economic development, some of our healthcare bills, they spend a lot of time being vetted and presented to legislators in the interim so that when we arrive, we hope that there is a game plan in which we have identified those priorities that are most important to us, and we prioritize those issues in such a short session. You know, New Mexico is the only legislator in America that is volunteer. So although we get reimbursed, you know, I think I'm reimbursed $180, maybe it went up to $200 a day. You know, good luck trying to find a hotel room that's less than that. And so we invest not just our time and our families. This is a large investment on our families as well, but there's a monetary investment for legislators to be up here as well. And so to extend that date without addressing either per diem increases or any kind of way to make sure that legislators are made whole, I think really narrows the target of people who have the ability and the means to be part of the legislator. And this should be a more open area to welcome ideas and people from everywhere, of course, even of working age. So there's a lot of conversation that takes place around there. I can tell you, I've said this before, the greatest value I would find is actually to have assistance in staffing, because not only are we a volunteer, but we don't have any help either. So when you call me in the interim, it is just me. There's no assistance when we address your issues, even in the interim.
And Senator, so would you be in favor of paying lawmakers?
I've stated this before. I don't think that's a partisan issue, and I do want to be at the table when we've talked about this. I've broken away by some members of my caucus saying I think that opens up the ability for working age people to get involved in the legislative process. We work for you. We carry the voice of you. We shouldn't be of just retirement age. You know, I've heard it jokingly said you either have to be rich, retired, or resourceful to serve in the legislature because you're leaving your job and your family behind. That's unnecessary and it's unfair, and I don't think it's fair to New Mexico constituents either.
And Senator, we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to bring up something that's been looming over this whole legislative session with the governor's State of the State address calling for a public safety package that includes looking at firearms and firearm-related legislation. And I just wanted to start out, I know there's a bill floating around that would essentially put a 7-day waiting period on individuals purchasing a firearm. Where do you stand on that?
I had a really good conversation with the sponsor of that bill, and I pride myself in being able to have those relationships with the other side. The intent of that bill is noble. It is to address suicide rates and how we come in and help those who are immediately in a time of crisis to delay that, to give some sort of bump on that. My response to that is noble, that is just, and I understand that reasoning, is that in addition, we should be investing and putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to mental health resources. I'll tell you that as we wrap up this legislative session, the priorities that were outlined in the first day of session and what we actually did on by the last day of session are not in line. There's not been major investments into public safety. We can claim that the state police got a large raise. That is true, a large salary raise. Other than that, I don't know of any sort of investment that was put into public safety. When we talk about mental health, there's some Medicaid reimbursement rates that were increased, some very small minor bills where we're going to have suicide prevention classes and maybe a number of college campuses, but not on a wide scale landscape. We have not invested in the mental health crisis that is a broken piece of this puzzle, that it deals with our homelessness, our addiction issues here in New Mexico, and to some extent has a very large impact on that CYFD crisis. We have not made major investments in mental health either. So at the end of this, when all we're doing is coming down to partisan divides that divides people over a constitutional right and is not necessarily fixing the problem that we've addressed, that we addressed needs to be fixed, it's extremely disappointing. I think that a large number of these bills are just to grab headlines. It further divides people out there, and it is not moving New Mexico. We have a very short time period up here to address crises that are really impacting New Mexico. This is not something that's keeping people up at night.
And Senator, we only have time for one more question, only about 30 seconds. But in a time that Americans are so politically divided, like you're saying, how can we come together and as New Mexicans and as Americans to get to a point where we are doing things that raise our quality of life rather than let these things divide us?
You know, it's the most disappointing thing, I think, and I see that as we go into an election year, I could actually see a lot of people start going further back to those parties. It's such a shame that our two-party system has such an influence over legislators, because the truth is that before we are a Democrat and before we are a Republican, we are a New Mexican. And if we can come to the table and address what is the problem and what are the best steps to take solutions there together, I've seen some really good things happen. The best policy that's ever come out of here are policies where legislators have come together on both sides of the chamber to create. Too often we see good policy that is poisoned by politics. We need to keep politics out of this place as much as we can. You know, that seems kind of like a joke here, but you know what? Leave the partisan politics aside. The best policies we create and push out of here have consensus from both sides. And look, if every side's left, you know, feeling like they had to give something, it's probably a win for the greater good of New Mexicans.
And that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Crystal Diamond Brantley is the senator for New Mexico's 35th District. Senator, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you guys for your interest. Stay engaged. Politics is too important to just be left to us politicians. Stay engaged.
Certainly. That's all for this season of Your Legislators. I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for following our coverage of New Mexico's legislative session. Remember, you can find us online at krwg.org to keep up with the latest news and local programming from our team. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Your Legislators.